Welcome back. In a moment, we'll return to our conversation about the African Union. But first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. The United States Republican Party have released their long-awaited plans for a replacement for the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. The Affordable Care Act allowed some 20 million previously uninsured US citizens to get coverage. Plans to undo those changes have become very controversial. North Korea and Malaysia have barred each other's citizens from leaving their countries. Both countries are engaged in an ongoing diplomatic spat after the North Korean leader's half-brother was assassinated at a Malaysian airport. And the European Space Agency has launched a new satellite as part of its multi-billion euro Earth observation programme. Sentinel-2B carries a high-resolution camera and will join its sister spacecraft, Sentinel-2A, in the task of providing a complete map of Earth. Back to the African Union now, and among the criticisms of the organisation are fears that it's helping to open the doors to a new colonial power on the continent, China. Since the turn of the century, China has emerged as Africa's largest trading partner. Chinese investment in the continent has grown consistently every year. The long-running relationship saw China gift the African Union their $200 million headquarters in Addis Ababa in 2012. Last year saw the most dramatic rise in investment, with a 515% surge from 2015. The investment in the continent also saw a 413% increase in jobs. Still with us is Stephen Chan, who's a professor of international relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Stephen, why has China focused quite so heavily on Africa?
I think there are a number of reasons. I mean, don't forget, this all seems like brand new material to us now, but China's been in Africa for a long time. They helped a very great number of liberation movements, for instance. And in those early days, from the 60s onwards, shortly after independence of African countries, the Chinese put in a lot of money on almost purely idealistic grounds. You're looking now at a different stage of Chinese investment with which the Africans are very happy, because this dream of becoming an economic superpower is only going to work with foreign investment and foreign help that comes without too many strings attached, particularly political strings, and the Chinese are doing that.
So they're happy just to do trade deals. They don't want to influence the politics of the country they're trading with.
They're not trying directly to influence the politics of the country.
But indirectly?
Indirectly, for instance, the longer that they keep trying to help the government of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe stay stable, for instance, increases the chances of Mr. Mugabe winning the next election. So there's always a knock-on effect. Ideologically and philosophically, the Chinese are committed to not interfering. But any state that puts in that amount of money into any African country is going to have a background influence.
There's always got to be payback, is the rather simplistic analysis. What is the payback that African nations might be suffering at the hands of the Chinese?
There's not going to be any immediate payback. What there is going to be, however, indisputably, is a long-term payback. And this is where the legendary antique Chinese patience has modern dress. The Chinese are prepared to wait for things that are now upstream to come downstream in 10, 20 years from now. Oil, for instance, that is just now in its prospecting stages. All of these things will fuel the next stage of Chinese development in about 2 decades' time. It's that kind of long game with which the Chinese are interested.
And is this a factor in the fact that the Chinese economy, although still a mammoth, is slowing? The graphs are starting to tilt down there in terms of growth, aren't they, and prosperity factors. So do they need to go somewhere else?
They were getting involved in this economic phase of relationship with Africa well before the current downturn. As for the downturn, all of us here in Europe would kill for 6.7% annual growth. So it's a slight slowdown, let us say, a structural adjustment perhaps that the Chinese economy required. The long-term outlook is that they're looking at, shall we, the Chinese, be fully competitive and be able to overtake, say, the United States in 10 to 20 years' time? And the investment in Africa is very much so that there will be the raw materials to enable Chinese industry to be able to do precisely that.
It's the fuel for the industry, isn't it? Would they also, perhaps, either by design or by accident, export the Chinese model of federal government?
Federal government may be a good in itself, and of course African states have tried federalism in their own right. Nigeria, for instance, has a federal state system. It hasn't always worked. It doesn't always work in China either, so that the volatility of the Chinese model itself doesn't really act as a good advertisement. China's got its own internal domestic problems, and I think African states are wily enough to understand that any model should not be imported by them willy-nilly. They're having enough trouble trying to develop viable models of their own.
And the accusations that China is effectively a sort of colonial power, raping the countryside of all the goodness and the natural resources, and then exiting when all that's exhausted. Is that a fair accusation, or is that a rather trivial characterization?
I think that's basically bad gripes from those who are losing out in the competitive capitalist stakes here. The Chinese just happen to have become very good at capitalist competition. But in fact, there are very few examples of the Chinese just exiting. And if you look at the work done by my counterpart in Washington, D.C., Professor Deborah Brautigan, she's torn apart what is mythological and what is actual in terms of Chinese entry and exit.
In what sense? That there's proof that may have done trade, they may have taken natural resources to export, but they've left behind what?
I think what she's trying to say is that many of the scare stories are simply untrue and unfounded. And as I said, there's very, very few examples of a sudden exit leaving only damage behind.
The Chinese relationship then looks set to stay for the time being, in fact, probably enhance still further.
It's going to stay, it's going to expand. Where the problems will come will not be from investment from the Chinese state or from state banks, but by private Chinese corporations. And the legacy so far of that has been one of undereducated leaders, managers of these private corporations, creating very great offense in Africa. Not to put too fine a point in it, the Chinese have got to get a hand on racism.
Okay, so that would be a stumbling block, because, of course, not all intervention can be state intervention. Some private enterprise can be seen a good thing in this context.
Yes, the Chinese state has actually got to get a grip on those who are operating privately in Africa and basically say to them, look, there's a standard of behavior, there are codes of behavior, there are labor legislations in all of these countries. You can't do it like back home.
Right, labour, and just let's focus on that just for a moment. Are the conditions for workers a consideration, or is that a luxury that we in the West now can accuse others of not meeting our standards, but where maybe 100, 200 years ago we were in exactly the same place?
Oh, absolutely, we were, but Africa now is very heavily legislated. It's a case of whether or not the legislation is observed. Zambia, for instance, has got very dense industrial legislation. But there, through very patient, protracted negotiation involving the Chinese companies, the Zambian government, and also the trade unions in Zambia, there's been vast tracts of agreement about how to proceed in the mining sector, for instance, and it's been a learning curve for everybody.
So perhaps it can be done. Stephen Chan, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. We end our programme with the Insight Bite. This is a little something that we feel you should know. Ford has announced plans to trial 3D printing for making car parts. The trials will initially include certain components such as spoilers in an effort to create lighter, fully customised parts. Analysts suggest that the industry will gradually begin to focus on 3D printing as an alternative to conventional manufacturing. The room-sized printer would allow the company to produce expensive car parts only when needed, cutting costs and production time. And that's all from me for now. I'm Martin Stanford. That was Insight.